thanks for everyone coming out. Thanks also to Richard and to Deb for getting into this colloquium you all have. And I'm going to talk today about a book that I just published a few months ago called The Brink of Freedom, Improvising Life in the 19th Century Atlantic World. And I'm going to zero in on a little snippet of that book. The book itself looks at two mid-19th century flashpoints in the Atlantic world, and asks us what they can teach us about one of the 19th century's most capacious, equivocal, and powerful concepts, freedom. So the two flashpoints are the black settler colonization of Liberia between 1820 and 1860, and the large Mayan uprising in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico that came to be known as the Caste, or the Caste War of Yucatan. And that war started in 1847. So I look at these two flashpoints, which are kind of unheralded, unrecognized, often imputed to be failed moments in the history of Atlantic world social movements, and try to see how we can treat their participants, namely black settlers from the US and Liberia and Mayan rebels in Yucatan, as theorists of freedom, right? So today I'm going to zero in on this little bit, the beginning of the Yucatan half of the book, where I argue that we can complicate our understanding of racial capitalism by attending to the complex interplay between indigeneity and blackness. So I'm going to offer this talk kind of in the spirit not only of the text that gave us this concept of racial capitalism in the Black Atlantic, Cedric Robinson's 1983 text, Black Marxism, but also in the spirit of Jack D. Forbes's remarkable but still neglected 1988 text, Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolution of Red-Black Peoples. I think, indeed, what I'm going to say here might be taken as a kind of humble effort to stage an implicit encounter between these two texts. So let's see if that works. All right, ready? In part 2, chapter 6 of Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson discusses the articulation of indigeneity and blackness in two short sections entitled Red, Whites, and Blacks, and Black for Red. On the one hand, in these sections, Robinson unfortunately reproduces the still persistent myth of the vanishing Indian, presuming that Europeans first colonized native peoples of the Americas to the point of genocide and then replaced their labor supply with Africans via transatlantic chattel slavery. Writes Robinson, the natives of the conquered lands were already a vanishing presence. The survival of New Spain's economy was already being transferred to new hands, from red to black. Of course, nowhere in the Americas did Indians simply vanish, and there was not so much a transfer of red to black as there was an articulation of red with black, which I think in Black Atlantic studies we still don't quite appreciate adequately. On the other hand, however, Robinson obliquely directs us toward a substantial challenge to this black for red or vanishing Indian narrative. Writing in these sections of 16th century Mexico or New Spain, Robinson tells us that the Aboriginal population, as he puts it, quote, the Aboriginal population would become the object of a most intensive exploitation by its Spanish conquerors, end quote. And he presents his evidence for this exploitation as a kind of testimony. Here's the rest of this passage. Quote, Chilam Balam, a native of the Yucatan, recalling the days of the pre-conquest, would write, there was then no sickness, they had no aching bones. They had then no high fever, they had then no smallpox, they had then no burning chest, they had then no abdominal pain, they had then no consumption, they had then no headache. At that time, the course of humanity was orderly. The foreigners made it otherwise when they arrived here. The word for which Chilam displayed such poetic nostalgia ended quickly, end quote. So Robinson's infelicitous account of the vanishing Indian sits uneasily alongside this more felicitous reference to Chilam Balam. We ought to be struck here, I think, by a kind of intimacy at the end of this passage, or at least a desire for an intimacy, when Robinson drops the putative surname Balam. This is not Chilam Balam anymore, but Chilam, a sort of friend with whom Black Marxism is on a first-name basis. Black Marxism's desire for intimacy with Chilam is amplified by the indistinct time to which Chilam is assigned with the present participle recalling and the conditional would write. Did Chilam write these words immediately after the conquest, or many years after the conquest, or even just the other day? It's impossible to tell from this passage. And both this indistinct time and this use of the familiar Chilam draws this native closer, as if Chilam were someone Robinson had just run into, or someone he had been waiting to catch up with. Chilam Balam speaks and is spoken, writes and is written from an indeterminate space and time in this passage that Black Marxism hopes somehow to be with, a space and time from which the Indian may not have vanished. To follow Robinson to the Yucatan and begin to understand how it articulates with what he calls racial capitalism, we must first ask, who is or was this informant, this presumptive friend of Black Marxism, this unvanishing Indian, this Chilam Balam, this Chilam? What did he write and when did he write it? First, Chilam Balam was not exactly a native of Yucatan recalling the days of the pre-conquest in writing, as Robinson suggests. In Yucatec Maya, the word Chilam literally means the one who is the mouth, and it could be translated as prophet or priest. Los Chilames were prophetic priests who interpreted passages from the gods for the people. The word Balam in turn means jaguar, and it's also a common Yucatec Maya surname. According to contemporary historians and anthropologists, there may well have been an important individual prophet from the late 15th or early 16th century named Chilam Balam, who played a role in passing on more ancient Mayan traditions and in linking them to the period immediately before the conquest. It seems as if this individual prophet, if he or she existed, may even have prophesied the arrival of the Spanish. There are, however, no written records that can be attributed solely to such an individual. We do know that by the time of the Spanish colonization, many towns in Yucatan had chilames, priests, who assembled what were called books of Chilam Balam, which were compilations of prophecies, chronicles, historical narratives, rituals, creation myths, almanacs, and medical treatises. Once written on bark covered in lime, and periodically reproduced and revised when an edition became too fragile, many of these books were infamously burned by Spanish missionaries, and none of the pre-conquest copies is known to have survived today. But as the Yucatec Maya language was converted into the Latin alphabet, a few of the books continued to be copied, revised, and passed on for generations. Today, 9 such books of Chilam Balam, dating from the 18th century, survive either as 18th century manuscripts, photographic reproductions, or copies made by hand in the 19th century, and they are named after the Yucatecan towns from which they derive. The passage Robinson quotes here, which he cites from Alfred W. Crosby's 1972 study, The Columbian Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492, comes from the book of Chilam Balam from Chumayel. And Chumayel is a town about 50 miles from Merida, northwestern Yucatan. This book, the Book of Chilam Balam from Chumayel, was compiled around 1782 by a Mayan man from Chumayel named Juan José Hiol, although others seem to have had a hand in writing it, and it was no doubt a revised copy of earlier texts. Although the 1782 edition has been lost, a copy made by hand in 1868 by Carl Hermann Berendt is held in the Brinton collection here at the University of Pennsylvania's Anthropology Museum Library. The 1868 copy Berendt made has been translated into Spanish and English and published numerous times in the 20th century, making it perhaps the most famous extant Yucatec Maya document from the colonial period. It's just such a 20th century translation of the 1868 Berendt copy of the 1782 Book of Chilam Balam from Chumayel that Robinson quotes via Crosby's The Columbian Exchange in this passage from Black Marxism. Got it? Who then was Carl Hermann Berendt, who left us this copy of the Book of Chilam Balam from Chumayel? Answering that question will edge us closer toward the Yucatan that appears in Robinson's Black Marxism under the figure of the unvanishing Indian named Chilam. Brent was born in Danzig, now called Gdansk in Poland. He took up a position teaching surgery and obstetrics at the University of Breslau in 1843, and in 1848 he became a member of the famous Frankfurt National Assembly, or Vorparlament, which set out to unify people, Germany under liberal principles. As a result of the conservative reaction to both the Assembly's attempted reforms and the more radical revolts of the period, however, Brent was removed from his professorship and went into exile in the Americas in 1851. After living in New York briefly, he traveled throughout Central America and Mexico, where he fashioned himself into a natural historian, linguist, ethnographer, and archaeologist. Working for the Smithsonian Institution and the Peabody Museum, he studied and recorded Maya languages, copied colonial documents, including the Libro de Chilam Balam de Chumayel, and appropriated, which is to say stole, vast quantities of natural and archaeological material, as well as human remains, for his patrons in the US. After a series of trips to New York in the 1870s to deliver his plunder to his sponsors, he purchased a coffee plantation in Coban, Guatemala. And it was on this plantation that Brent died quite suddenly on May 12th, 1878. Now, Brent's imperial antiquarianism throughout Belize, the Petén, and Yucatan was shaped by the ongoing caste war of Yucatan. A massive Mayan uprising against Creole authority on the peninsula which started in 1847 and lasted at least until 1901. Although, and as Richard knows well, if you talk to Maya in the Yucatan today, many of them will tell you that this caste war is still going on. As Brent explains in a travel narrative he published with the Smithsonian Institution in 1867, called Report of Explorations in Central America, his plans to travel west from Belize to Guatemala's Petén region and then north into Yucatan during 1866 was stalled in the town of San Pedro Buenavista because of what he calls, quote, the recently received news of a revolution which had broken out, end quote, which is a reference to the ongoing conflict. So here we are, Yucatan, right? Belize. This is the Petén region. And Brent is trying to go roughly through here towards this lake. So Brent's account of this delay he encountered in 1866 offers him the opportunity to reflect on the context in which the region is set and on the effects of the caste war. He writes in his report, quote, I was obliged to stop in San Pedro until messengers sent through the wilderness could procure from the corregidor of Petén the necessary number of carriers. More than a month passed before they arrived, a month lost for explorations, as the necessary vigilance over my baggage in an undisclosed hut among thieving Negroes forbade my being absent from the place. Some few reptiles, fishes, Coleoptera, and molluscs were, however, collected. The villages in the neighborhood of this farm are of late origin, peopled by Indians from Yucatan, almost every one of them formally engaged in the war of races, which for the last 20 years has desolated that unhappy country. So here, Brent captures a volatile moment in the region. As refugees fled south from the conflict in Yucatan into the Petén, and again, so the wars begins around here, and with the refugees, many refugees, thousands, tens of thousands of refugees were pushed south into the region where he was residing and where he intended to go. So as these refugees fled south from the conflict in Yucatan into the Petén, northern Guatemala was drawn into the caste war's wake. Populated also by blacks who worked the region's logging industry, some of whom had migrated from free black or maroon communities in Belize and the wider Caribbean. These are who Brent refers to as thieving Negroes. The Petén was networked into an economically and politically volatile region, which itself was networked into the wider Atlantic world. As this passage shows, however, and ironically for the liberal Brent, who had to leave Germany's revolutionary 1840s thanks to the conservative reaction of the 1850s, This volatility was primarily a roadblock to his colonial ventures in linguistics and archaeology. Brent goes on to explain that some Maya in the Petén who reside alongside these thieving Negroes are, quote, poorly educated, unrestrained, and with but few necessities, lead a lazy and sensual life, much given to gambling and intoxication, and joining now and then in a petty conspiracy or even an open revolt. Unquote. Indeed, he suggests that it's the region's black logwood workers who degrade the Maya amongst them. He writes, there are on the Belize River only woodcutting establishments belonging to merchants and Belize. These are either being actually worked under the direction of a foreman, usually a mulatto, or abandoned, the buildings being occupied by Negroes who make a scanty living cutting logwood on their own account, which they sell in Belize, bringing back brandy and dry provisions, their only food, as they are too indolent to plant anything in the fertile grounds around their decaying huts. Only where Yucatan Indians have settled among them, a cornfield, a banana plantation, or fruit trees are to be found. So, of course, Brent effectively fails to recognize the vast and vigorous economies of exchange blacks and Indians forged in the region because he's so attached to a European racial hierarchy dating back to Bartolome's Casas. Noble and productive Indians are worthy of his admiration when they are considered in isolation and subject to his pity when corrupted by their proximity to black people. Reading this passage against the grain of these overt racial hierarchies, however, we can glean from Brent's reflections a multiracial scene of labor, colonial settlement, and black and Indian autonomism. Black workers, themselves likely refugees from servitude in the wider Caribbean, are here shown to labor both in the colonial logging industry and on what he calls a cornfield, alongside Maya caste war refugees and settlements at once articulated with a global economy and improvised as relatively autonomous, self-elected communities. This so-called cornfield was likely what indigenous peasants called and still call a milpa. But milpa were and are much more than a cornfield, so keep that in mind and we'll return to that a bit later. Brent's itinerant antiquarianism throughout Yucatan unsettles the figure of the vanishing Indian, which we encountered in Robinson's Black Fur Red narrative then. For his travel narrative shows us that diverse Maya factions lived varying degrees of subjugation to and autonomy from those Brent calls Mexicans and Spaniards, working intimately with black laborers from the Atlantic world who brought to Yucatan and Central America their own histories of engagement with and resistance to the rise of racial capitalism. Furthermore, these Maya appear to have had a deep historical awareness of centuries of colonization, to which they respond both with accommodation, as what Brent elsewhere calls laborious and orderly workers, and with resistance as cultivators of the milpa, who have not forgotten to hate their colonizers. Thus, when Brent writes in the first passage I showed you of villages throughout the Petén peopled by Indians from Yucatan, almost every one of them formerly engaged in the War of Races, which for the last 20 years has desolated that unhappy country, he reveals one of the key features of the caste war's impact on racial capitalism in the region. By destroying the peninsula's sugar industry and moving south to the Petén, Maya rebels and refugees from the war partially withdrew their labor from early 19th century Creole development and renegotiated their relationship to global capital. In turn, when Brent complains of being delayed on his expedition due to thieving Negroes who stole some of his baggage in San Pedro Buenavista, and when he disparages the, quote, Negroes who are too indolent to plant anything in the fertile ground around their decaying huts, end quote, unless the Indians help, he inadvertently reveals the multiracial scene of this challenge to the region's racial capitalism. As Brent elaborates on the conflictual racial dynamics of this caste war conjuncture in his report, he also reveals that Maya had their own understanding of the inconvenience he calls the War of Races. Quote, I had the opportunity to become acquainted with many of the Indian refugees from Yucatan and the Petén, and obtaining interesting information as to their social and political condition. They are by no means hostile to the white man in general. Their hatred is directed against the Mexican and the Spaniard only. While they are friendly to other foreigners and are remarkably frank and outspoken with such strangers as speak their language and know how to gain their confidence, end quote. Who were these so-called Mexicans and Spaniards to whom the Maya directed their hatred? Often called Creoles, the ruling minority in Yucatan was represented politically and culturally by the period's leading Creole intellectual, Justo Sierra OReilly, especially in a series of letters, of articles he wrote in the late 1840s for a journal he founded in Campeche in Yucatan called El Fénix. And so in this series of articles, he offers the paradigmatic Creole account of the causes of the caste war. He begins by blaming what he calls profetas yucatecos, or Yucatecan prophets, for sowing dissent among the Maya majority. As he writes, quote, extravagant, incomprehensible, and ominous language, end quote, of these prophets helped to foster Indian barbarism during the 16th century, which is to say, Indian refusal to assimilate to colonial norms, and that such language continues to thrive in the mid-19th century amongst Mayan rebels. Principal among Justo Sierra OReilly's culpable Yucatecan prophets is none other than Chilam Balam. He writes in these articles, quote, that prophet, who was called Chilam Balam and who gained extraordinary respect, had cloaked his remarkable prophecies in high-sounding, forbidding pageantry, full of vain words and feeling that were beyond the grasp of the people, end quote. Indeed, some years earlier, Sierra OReilly had expanded on his critique of Chilam Balam in another journal called El Museo Yucateco. In an article called Profetas Yucatecas, Sierra OReilly begins by acknowledging the power Chilam Balam has throughout the peninsula. He writes, quote, there are no old women, housekeepers, vergers, or chaplains in the villages, or even the cities of this country who do not speak of dark prophecies or mysterious words that portend blood, catastrophe, earthquakes, and floods. When we were children, Chilam Balam was a terrifying man, a man who froze the blood in our veins. Who is Chilam Balam? What a phenomenal being he is, able to strike terror into the hearts of young and old alike. The question the article poses, then, is not simply a historical one. It asks not just who this person of Chilam Balam was, but how the figure of Chilam Balam continues to haunt the entire peninsula, old and young, city and village alike. It quickly becomes clear that the author disdains not only Chilam Balam, whoever he might have been, but also the terror the very idea of him popularly evokes. The article goes on to describe its author's visit to the archives of Merida in search of an early modern text that could shed light on who Chilam Balam was, or if he existed at all. When Sierra OReilly asks a well-known local friar he calls Padre Zuniga about Chilam Balam, Zuniga unfurls, quote, an enormous roll of damp, almost illegible papers in the Maya language, in italics, end quote. Dated February 27, 1697, the document seems original and authentic, quote, except that it was not a copy, but a rough draft of the first document of its kind, end quote. So Zuniga has apparently presented Sierra OReilly with a manuscript very much like one of the books of Chilam Balam that Karl Hermann Brandt copied and Cedric Robinson quoted. Sierra OReilly's article goes on to describe the book as, quote, excessively extravagant, a book full of violent, monstrous, and ugly language, one that calls upon its gods for help in the struggle against los blancos, or, writes Sierra OReilly using the Maya word for whites, tzutlo, which comes from the Maya word tzul, for foreigner. Tzutlo is like whites or blancos, often translated as blancos. So it's this very extravagance that Sierra OReilly observes in this supposed document that Zuniga shows him, that somehow convinces Sierra OReilly not to take the book seriously, to dismiss it, in effect, as a contemporary fake. Because Padre Zuniga is enraged at Sierra OReilly's skepticism, the inquisitive Creole intellectual seeks out another of Merida's learned scholars, someone called Pablo Moreno, who definitively rejects the manuscript in terms Sierra OReilly accepts. He told us that Father Zuniga's manuscript was nothing but a tissue of lies that were deliberately dreamed up to prevent the emigration of indigenous people who, attracted by the abundance and fertility of the lands in Petén and the Lacandones, left their villages and settlements in the Yucatan in the hope of improving their situation in a country that had not yet been subdued by the Spanish. So the document, according to Sierra OReilly, is a tissue of lies, because it enlists Chilam Balam to convince Maya to abandon Creole domination for autonomy in the Yucatán, a notion so preposterous to OReilly that it can be dismissed outright. In conclusion, OReilly continues here with this passage, we can be sure that what is said these days about Chilam Balam is just a fable, an ill-conceived tale that is even more poorly explained. Children and old women can sleep peacefully because their slumber will not be disturbed by the ominous words of Chilam Balam, or any of the other Yucatecan prophets. And then he adds a footnote to that passage that reads, we remember having read, but don't recall exactly where, that Chilam Balam is an Eastern name that is used as we use it these days, and that it was brought here by the first white settlers of Yucatan with an ulterior motive, as people say. So Chilam Balam, according to OReilly, is not a real threat to Yucatan's populace because he's merely a recent fantasy, probably dreamed up by the colonizers themselves. So when Cedric Robinson writes of Chilam in Black Marxism, he's simply not offering a Mayan perspective on how Indians thrived before colonization and then suffered from Spanish colonial brutality. What's more, that perspective of Chilam Balam cannot function as evidence of the replacement of Indians by Africans in the Americas, as it does in the section from Black Marxism called Black for Red. Rather, Robinson reproduces a figure who's been translated, transcribed, and invoked countless times for centuries, more recently by the 19th century German liberal in exile Brent, who became an imperial agent of ethnographic and archaeological power and knowledge, as well as by the 19th century Yucatecan liberal OReilly, who became the intellectual voice of violent Creole efforts to suppress Maya rebels during the early years of the Caste War. The Chilam, whom Robinson represents as an individual native of Yucatan, who would write a history that Black Marxism needs to know intimately, is then the name of a multi-part social text, a legendary prophet as well as many prophets, a book as well as many books, made of Yucatecan lime and bark as well as European paper, copied many times by hand, both by Mayans and Europeans, in a language at once Maya and Spanish. It's a history of Maya revolt, at once local to Yucatan and global in its ties to European colonialism and to 1848s throughout Europe and the Americas. And it's a transnational conflict and contact zone whose very racial form was a site of contestation and struggle. So the question then becomes, how might we read this social text of and in Black Marxism? How might we follow up on Black Marxism's desire for a certain critical intimacy with this figure, this social text of Chilam? And how, even more specifically, might we push past the limits of Brents and OReilly's colonial perspectives on this caste war conjuncture? Well, while the war was raging on the ground in the 19th century, Maya rebels engaged in a parallel kind of written war, penning letters in Yucatec Maya and Spanish to their Creole antagonists, making demands and offering terms. In and through their empirical and strategic concerns, these letters teach us what racial capitalism meant to those who challenged it in the mid-19th century Yucatan. And against much of the contemporary historiography on the caste war, I think, they show Maya rebels to be remarkably global in their quotidian concerns, to be acutely aware of the articulation of blackness and indigeneity, both as an effect of capitalist development and as a potentially potent challenge to it, and to be subaltern, autonomous theorists of freedom. So let me now turn to this epistolary archive, this remarkable set of letters that Mayan rebels during the Caste War wrote to further unpack this social text of Chilam and push past the limits of the kind of colonial perspectives of Brent and OReilly. Consider, for instance, a striking letter written on April 7, 1850 by 7 Maya leaders from a rancho called Has in the south of the peninsula to Creole priest and commissioner Jose Cantuvela. referencing a pact that they made with Creole leaders who quickly violated its terms. They declare, if you have forgotten, I would remind your excellency about it, if it is indeed just that you have forgotten it. And they continue with this passage. You well know what agreement was made with us. For this we are fighting. That no tax will be paid by white, black, or Indian. 10 pesos for baptism for the white, for the black, and for the Indian. 10 pesos for weddings for the white, for the black, and for the Indian. As far as debts, that the old ones will not be paid by the white, nor the black, nor the Indian. And that it will not be necessary to buy land. The white, the black, or the Indian can plant their milpa wherever he wants, and no one will prohibit it. End quote. As they call for the end of certain taxes and the more equitable application of others, as well as the cancellation of old debts and free access to land for cultivation, note how the Rancho Haas correspondents invoke Caste distinctions that the Creole state used to secure racial capitalist development, only to repurpose those distinctions. Writing for and with el blanco, el negro y el indígena, the white, the black, and the Indian, in the past, present, subjunctive, and future tenses, they cast the region's system of racial capitalism into a future where and when difference would articulate with a certain universality without either dissolving into formal and abstract equality or ossifying into hierarchy. That is, they draw upon casta distinctions among the white, the black, and the Indian, but neither to propose their assimilation into an abstract Yucatecan or Mexican citizenship, nor to fix their particularities. Rather, they improvise life for the future. As they conclude the letter, though our elders have died, we continue to live. Throughout this project, the figure of the milpa is central. Taken in its narrowest sense, the milpa is a field in which indigenous peasants alternate the planting of beans, corn, chiles, and squash to provide sustenance and to keep the soil enriched. More broadly, however, the milpa names a way of collectively organizing economic, political, kinship, and gender relations on quotidian and seasonal scales with pre-colonial origins, as well as ongoing post-conquest revisions. Much more than just plots of land individuals or families used for sustenance, the cornfield that Brent refers to, milpa were networked into regional indigenous market economies of barter and monetary exchange, allowing Maya a measure of control over social, political, and economic relations, otherwise dominated by the Creole state, church, and large landowners. As Nancy Ferris adds, from pre-colonial times, milpa also had a significant religious component, expressed by the milpa ceremonies, in which offerings from the field are made to the gods at ancient ruin sites, as well as in family households and in the fields themselves. These ceremonies persisted even after many other elements of Maya religion were suppressed by colonial authorities and were certainly an active element of Maya life during the Caste War period. Alicia Ray Cruz has even shown how important the figure of the milpa has been during the 20th century rise of transnational and neoliberal economic development. Maya, who today live in rural pueblos but travel long distances to work in tourist sites like Cancun, regularly joke of the hotels and restaurants where they work as their modern milpa. So during the 19th century, as a kind of subsistence mode of production, milpa ameliorated the ever-increasingly brutal extraction of surplus value from the Maya by Creole colonizers, and thus, in a certain way, facilitated the development of racial capitalism in the region. However, even as it helped to sustain Maya communities enough to make them available for exploitation, milpa production also paradoxically antagonized the kind of global capitalist development Yucatecan Creoles were seeking to establish with the industrial production of sugar, its associated liquor production, and henequen, by keeping vast tracts of land out of the hands of such production. For Creoles, the milpa thus represented a stubborn and backward indigenous resistance to modernization. In fact, Creoles often called these lands baldios, or wastelands. Throughout the period, then, Creoles waged war against the milpa in an effort to expropriate indigenous land, to draw Maya away from milpa production, and to push them into peonage or wage labor on a mass scale, even as Creoles depended upon the milpa to sustain Maya for exploitation, and Maya turned to the milpa as a site of struggle against expropriation and dispossession. As such, milpa should really be considered alongside the Afro-diasporan provision grounds of the Caribbean or Hosa in Brazil, right? During the Caste War especially, the milpa thus became part of a material and representational struggle over racial capitalism. This is vividly illustrated in a letter written on December 27, 1849, from the outskirts of a Yucatan village by Eusebio Ake to the regional commander, Paulino Pech. In the process of reporting to Pech, whom he calls father in a kind of sign of respect, about local conflicts between Maya and Creoles, as well as among Maya themselves, Ake writes this. Father, I know that Don Jose Maria Barrera is not my chief. He commands the security patrols on the main road to Chucab. I've already seen a letter to the worthy gentleman Don Francisco. Father, he did not give me something because this is a manuscript, so some parts of it are illegible. Father, he did not give me something because the milpas along the side of the road to Chucab have been harvested by the enemies, but only those that are 2 leagues from the road. They have not harvested the ones that are farther away. So the enemy has not harvested the milpas that are 3 leagues from the road to Chucab, where there are many of them, which is why I'm informing Your Excellency about this. Father, something in the name of God, our Lord, please give us your something to be charged with going to find the reservists to replenish this village's detachment. Father, because the troops were once at full strength, but then they scattered outside the village. Father, if the troops are not at full strength, the enemies will harvest all the milpa in something the main road is not protected. Father, they have killed so many people in these settlements. Ake is concerned not only with who is cultivating which milpa, but also with milpa that go uncultivated due to conflict. The milpa are thus cultivated not simply by planting, but by a much wider range of social and political actions, such as the raising of troops, the protection of roads, the dispersal of population, and even the killing of residents of the area's ranchos. When the Rancho Haas correspondents thus demanded in the letter I showed you earlier that the white, the black, or the Indian can plant their milpa wherever he wants and no one will prohibit it, they do not make a simple, backward, traditional, pre-capitalist, or provincial claim. Rather, they point to a conflictual crossroads, a scene of struggle and potential very well described here by Ake. For another instance, consider how on November 15, 1849, 2 rebel leaders from another village, Juan Biobut and Jose Maria Canul, warned government officials to stop harming their community. But I ask also the gentlemen not to pillage the milpas, because we know that they are taking the corn to Valladolid to be sold. If they had harvested only what they needed for their consumption, it would not all be gone. I'll just break the quote here for a second. Here, the letter challenges the extraction of surplus from milpa harvests for a wider market. Not simply a defense of a primitive mode of production for sustenance, then. The milpa is here defended as and through a critique of surplus value extraction. But and Canul thus represent their defense of milpas as an intimate part of the struggle for their very life. Referring to the passage I just quoted, nobody is willing to do it precisely because you harm them. I've sent the commanders the letter I received from His Excellency the Governor, as well as the note from the commissioners, in which they asked me not to harm the bearer of the letter. We've also instructed not to harm any of you while you're engaged in the delivery of this correspondence. So in these caste war letters, then, a thriving milpa is precisely the condition of possibility not only for ongoing Maya participation in the Yucatán state as citizens, but also for a certain improvisation of life itself in the face of 19th century racial capitalism. Rather than stage a choice between Maya assimilation to Creole norms or Maya separation from those norms, these letters demand the universal freedom and equality that comes with recognition by the state, alongside or appositionally with ongoing milpa production in the face of, or oppositionally to, the Creole pursuit of capitalist development for the world market. They thus imagine a future that is yet to be fully formulated, a future in which those who have been excluded from or subject to Creole norms of universal citizenship and economic development will continue to claim and repurpose those norms. So when Cedric Robinson writes in Black Marxism of Chilam Balam as a native of Yucatan recalling the days of the conquest, he activates the myth of the vanishing Indian to make a case for racial capitalism's emergence at a moment of what he calls black for red. But when he drops the punitive surname and writes of Chilam as a kind of friend he'd like to catch up with, Black Marxism reaches back through Crosby's The Columbian Exchange, through Brent's travel narrative and the book of Chilam Balam, Chimael, through the so-called thieving Negroes of San Pedro and the Yucatan Indians and their so-called cornfield. He reaches through this social text toward a black radical Atlantic, where caste war rebels and refugees and black logwood workers and maroons from Rancho Haas, the Petén and Belize fought for and with El Blanco, El Negro y El Indígena, the white, the black, and the Indian, for old debts to be canceled, for dispossessed land to be returned, and for milpa, be they in the broad, fat plains of 19th century Yucatan or the hotel bathrooms of Cancun, as a vital scene of struggle on the brink of freedom. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Are we doing questions?
Questions?
Hey, Richard.
I'll jump in. I'm not sure it's a question, more of a comment.
Yeah.
I think your framing of the MILPA in this sort of broader context of freedom of rights in some sense is interesting, because, and you bring this up in the book, but it's one of the interesting events that occurs during the Caste War is in the end not taking the two largest cities, and they surround the cities and they're ready to go. And the commentary is always, oh, they went home to plant their milpa.
Yeah.
And that they gave up on the war. And it's a fascinating thing, because it never felt comfortable to me that in the middle of this potential of taking over the entire land, they just went home to plant. And it's almost the sense, it's spoken about in historical text almost as if sort of poor stupid Maya Indians went home because it was time to plant.
Yes, exactly.
You frame it differently with this conception of milpa. And it's something else that we're thinking about, which is almost the idea that warfare and conquest doesn't have to occur on a sort of a frontal basis as if the expectation within war, but that almost a guerrilla war can then ensue and occur, which would be much more tied to this construct of rebellion.
Yes.
And so I think both of these are trying to give a new vision of why the final battles didn't occur.
Yes. Yes.
So that's more of a comment.
Thanks so much. I'm very with you on that. The kind of standard in around 1848, the initial Maya kind of offenses were so effective and so many people killed that it seems like many Maya troops and rebels were on the kind of outskirts of Merida and Campeche. And if you read the Creole newspapers of the day, there's lots of panic about how the cities are going to be overrun. In fact, the U.S. sends warships down to Yucatan to prepare to evacuate the Creoles or the Blancos after people like Usos or OReilly plead to the U.S. for rescue, right? In fact, they even asked the U.S. to annex the Yucatan in order to help them in the struggle against the Caste war rebels. Now, some have said that is a kind of hysteria on the part of the Creoles, and maybe the Maya rebels weren't kind of that close to overrunning the cities. Others have argued that they weren't sophisticated enough or smart enough to understand that you have to seize kind of urban centers in order to control the sovereignty of a region, and that they foolishly, as Richard said, went back to tend to their milpa, because around the time they retreated was around the time of a kind of cultivation time. So I think all those accounts are wrong, and that first of all, the Maya rebels were not seeking conquest of the peninsula, and they weren't seeking a seizure of the state in a way that we might think of 20th century anti-colonial radicals seeking. In fact, almost never do you ever see any single demand about sovereignty in these letters. What they want is ongoing participation alongside the Yucatecan state in a negotiated kind of what we would today call a kind of autonomous mode, right? And so, the retreat to the Milpa ought to be seen not so much as a military failure, like you're saying, or as a kind of ignorance, which many contemporary historians simply name it that, but rather part of this ongoing effort to rework and recast their relationship to these Caste distinctions that they have been subject to, right? And so the Milpa is like a name for this kind of at once accommodation to racial capitalist development and this antagonism, or at least agonism, vis-a-vis that development, right? And so when the Milpa is invoked as the reason they don't conquer the cities, actually right there we have a whole account of anti-colonial resistance that we ought to learn from. Like, in fact, they're trying to teach us a different account of anti-colonial resistance, one that does not demand sovereignty, one that does not require total military victory, but that is organized by different coordinates, right? And thus can still be going on today. Not under the sign of failure, but under the sign of ongoing kind of efforts to improvise life in the face of oppression.
Which is part of that sort of guerrilla warfare that I think begins to occur then and continues all the way up to today.
Yeah.
In a much more subtle framing of what resistance is.
Totally, even if, as Elizabeth Cruz says, it's a joke on a bus from Teosuco to Cancun to clean bathrooms about how off we go to the Milpa, right? Even if it's in the mode of a joke like that.
Just following on that, and thanks, David, for sharing with us. It seems like that sensibility is also what animates then Cedric Robinson's address.
Yes.
Right? Because being a 20th century person, post-colonial, with a particular aspirational framework for what revolution could and should be, he's looking to Chilam, first name, for that realization and not quite finding it. You know, I mean, I find that to be a really interesting move on his part. That's really all about his own positionality, within thinking about, you know, what freedom means or what it should look like, and not at all necessarily, and for such a careful scholar, it's strange, you know, not at all able to put that within its historical context at the time. And of course now I think being on the other side of that moment, you know, where everybody is in the disenchantment of post-colonialism, you know, there are so many more accounts, scholarly accounts that we have of failure, you know, or questioning what sovereignty, what the object of sovereignty really is it state power, etc., that he wouldn't have had access to in the 80s, you know, late 70s, 80s when he's writing. So I'd love to hear what you think about, you know, his own failure to understand that moment in a way.
Well, I mean, that moment just gives me chills every time I read it. It's so moving, and it's so, to me, speaks to the brilliance in a way of this scholar who, as many of you know, we recently, you know, tragically lost, but who still speaks to us with his incredible work. And I think that, exactly as you say, historically speaking, he's situated in a moment where people are looking for resistance in certain forms, and also just in terms of sources. He doesn't have, it's actually remarkable that he shifts that Crosby source, which has millions more problems than Robinson does. He uses that and shifts it in such a way that he brings us to the verge of a call, which we then need to take up, for an intimacy between Black Marxism and this figure of Chilam. You know, I mean, that's how I read that moment, like, and so many moments in that incredible book, where you have to read closely enough. I was saying to somebody earlier, I was saying to you that I think people read Black Marxism too quickly sometimes and read it as just kind of an outdated intellectual history. And if you spend time with it and in the pores of its sentences and phrases like this, you see these remarkable moments that are asking for us to do some work, you know. And so I really hope this comes across as very much in the spirit of an honor of him and his work. I mean, he kind of put me onto it in a certain way, you know, passage like that.
other questions?
Any other questions?
Hi.
Hi, this is changing sort of a different type of question, but
Sure.
but I'm intrigued with your work in the sense that both what you're choosing to work with, the types of documents you're choosing to work with, and then also sort of how you present them, as opposed to maybe the way we're more used to seeing them presented in an anthropology context. So,
Yeah.
for example, I find it interesting where mostly what we saw were quotes, typed up presumably by you on the screen, as opposed to images of the texts themselves or where they came from. So I was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on sort of how ideas about material texts and things come into this, and the types of documents you're drawing on and how those affect your work in various ways. Because this definitely draws together, like contemporary social theory with historical letters, with, archaeological remnants, and, in all these different ways. So I think that's really interesting, but I'd like to hear you reflect on it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how could you write pen and not think about material text, right? Yeah, mostly they're in this form here because I've translated them from Maya or Spanish for people to read in English. I'm obviously not Robinson's book, but the other passages, so that makes it easier there. But the material form of a lot of the texts are really important to me. So for instance, let's take the letters that I concluded with. So they tend to be written on, pretty cheap paper. They tend to be written in Yucatec Maya or in Spanish. And you read them after they have been received by their Creole addressees, and then if they're only written in Yucatec Maya, translated into Spanish. And so what you get in the archives is either the 19th century Creole translation of the original letter into Spanish and no original in Yucatec Maya, or the original letter in Spanish, written in Spanish by Maya, or both the Maya and the Creole translation. And so you have to work both on the level of translation to think about some of what gets lost and gained in translation. And also, you get a very tactile sense for the quotidian nature of these documents. They're very, and also you then are called upon, which I've done, to research like the postal networks in the peninsula, which are very important to the war, to the conflict, and to the Maya prosecution of this kind of written war alongside. So that's why I call it a kind of written war alongside the physical war, because they send hundreds of these letters, making demands, offering reports, making requests, making claims in very quotidian terms about tax rates, 10 pesos for baptism, etc. And so it's tempting, as someone who's trained both as a kind of literary scholar and a historian, to read these documents as documents that will answer the classic social history question: who did what, where, when, and why. Right? And they do provide answers to such questions. But I'm more interested in another set of questions, which are conditioned by answers to those social history questions, but move beyond them and away from them, which is the question of how do these letters theorize freedom, right? So how can we read these seemingly quotidian, everyday documents as texts on par with philosophical treatises from the 19th century that we readily grant that status to, like Hegel's Phenomenology? Like, why don't we ask, where did Hegel write that? What village did he live in when he wrote the Phenomenology? And, what were the economic and social relations of that village that allowed him to write the Phenomenology? I mean, those would be interesting questions, but we never ask them that because we grant that text the status of theorizing freedom. And yet we read this, and we only seem able to ask social history questions. Well, who are these people? Where did they live? What did they do? What did they think? Why can't we also ask, well, what's the theory of freedom in this text? And I think that's the way I try to kind of read the very tactile and quotidian nature of these texts beyond the limits of some of the questions that get asked of material textuality. You know what I'm saying?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Andy?
The Milpa seems to me, based on the presentation, to be not just a crop production system, but a system that embodies a critique of a particular mode of production and embraces an expression of freedom, an alternative mode of production, that from a discourse from another continent would be called the commons.
would be called commons, yes.
So I'm wondering, and you know, the Paris Communes happened in the context of the dates that you're using as well, of course, goes back hundreds of years to the
Yeah.
alcohols, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether your research gives us insights into the sort of details of their understanding of ownership and governance of the milk
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
And does that compare or contrast with the notion of the commons that would have been present in Paris at the same time?
This is a great question. So I'm obsessed with the commons because the project I'm doing now is on the 1690s and cases of two Afro-diasporans, one in Merida in Yucatan and one in Boston, who offer, I think, in legal cases they got involved in critiques of dispossession that are different from ones that we're used to today. So I've been thinking a lot about commons. And and commons are, of course, a figure today through the work of folks like Fred Moten and Stefan O'Harney for a kind of collective social anti-capitalist action. And I'm very sympathetic to that project. But it's complicated because in the Americas, anything that was called a commons was always already dispossessed from Native people. So there were commons throughout the Americas, created by white settlers, stolen from Native people, and then collectivized. So the commons oughtn't to have, to me in the Americas, the same romantic resonance that it does in Europe, right? And there are historians of commons in Europe that would also, raise some questions about it. And Marx himself never romanticized feudal commons, right? First of all, I'm trying to figure out ways to talk about sites like this and scenes of dispossession like this and resistance to dispossession without romanticizing something like a commons as a place, a piece of land, let's say, which had autochthonous, over which people had autochthonous possession, original and confirmed possession. Because often in indigenous communities throughout the Americas, who had their land taken from them to create white settler commons, were themselves stolen from other indigenous people, right? So we have to be able to talk about so-called primitive accumulation, as Marx would have it, and dispossession of lands held in common, like milpa, without imputing to that land an originary moment of autochthonous, pure possession that is dispossessed, right? And the figure of the milpa in all these letters works really well that way because it refuses, in the way my rebels write about it, to be this kind of quaint pre-capitalist scene, right? In fact, it's the Creoles who write about it that way. It's the Spanish colonizers who constantly write about milpa as part of these baldíos, these wastelands that are this ancient and outdated mode of relating to the land and growing food and that needs to be updated, right? They're the ones who write about that. You never see indigenous people write about ejidos or milpa in this way. They're names for relationships to the land that are at once ancient, prehistorical in terms of having records of them, and modern, contemporary, right? And the milpa that these guys are referring to is modern, is as modern as it is ancient, right? In fact, it scrambles that mulitarist conception of temporality that we're used often to understand folks' relationships to land. It refuses to be either pre-capitalist, atavistic, ancient, or modern in the sense of the large landowners and their industrial sugar production. It's like at once ancient and contemporary. And I think that's another thing they're theorizing for us and teaching us. Like, don't think that this is, we're just happily tending our corn, just like we have for thousands of years. I think a lot of early anthropologists make that mistake when they write about the milpa as this ancient, territory. Instead, it's a scene of struggle, ongoing struggle, and contemporary relationship to, not pure resistance either, but relationship to racial capitalist development. Because like I said, it's also, capitalism needs these provision grounds in the Caribbean or these milpa, it needs them to, for laborers to be able to reproduce themselves, right? And they were networked, these milpa were networked into, they're not just like an individual family has a milpa and they eat what they grow, they're networked into really local markets that are themselves networked into global markets, just like the Persian grounds were in the Caribbean, right? They're very much articulated with the world system, but in an agonistic way, and sometimes here, that gets turned into an outright antagonism or a war, right? Does that make sense?
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Actually, on this note, I was going back and forth between thinking about the figure of the milpa in racial capitalism, right? Because at times it appeared to me that the milpa appeared as a history to Deepesh Chakrabarty's terms, an inside-outside disturbance, sometimes cooperating with the production of capitalism and sometimes not.
Exactly.
And other times it seemed like the constitutive outfit that was required for capitalism to be sustain itself quite literally in the reproduction of bodies of the people that were working the farms and sending crops. So I was wondering if you could help me understand where along that continuum we might think of the milpa as interruption, as formation, or something between.
I mean, I think that it depends on from what perspective we're interpreting it. So from the Creole, 19th century Creole perspective, or even today in Mexico, it is a kind of outside that might not be quite constitutive, but is locatably outside proper development, right? And must be brought within, right? And yet, from the perspective of these rebels, they're trying to teach us that it's more on the model of Chakrabarty's, kind of at once inside and outside. And so I think that it's not, for me, it's not possible to answer the question objectively, the milpa is this or is that. It's more like, how does the milpa function as not just a physical place, but an idea, a practice, a set of social relations. Just like Marx reminds us that the commodity is not a thing, it's a set of social relations that we think of as a thing. So too is the milpa not simply a place, it's an ongoing, vibrant, dynamic set of social relations. It's not static. And so sometimes it gets positioned as a kind of baldío, a wasteland outside. Other times that position, by Maya and Creole alike, who are all on all sides of this conflict always, right? Other times it gets positioned as, I think in these letters often, a site within capitalism that is disrupting its normal functioning and may rise to other levels of fuller disruption. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I'd love to hear you reflect on how you see what you are doing in relation to Richard's archaeological project.
Well, I wrote about this in the coda of the book. So Richard is doing a project on 19th century, on the Caste War in the 19th century, and archaeological project, which blew my mind when I found out that you were doing that, and I was in the middle of researching this project when I found out, and you've been so kind to invite me down to your site so many times, and I've learned a lot being there. One really specific thing I learned from going to the site that Richard's been working at in a village called Tela, right next to a village called Teosuco, which is exactly the place where the Caste War broke out. Tela was one of these, lots of the villages in Yucatan were depopulated from refugees and from people being killed during this conflict, and many disappeared, which is to say they fell off contemporary maps and out of the imaginary of cosmopolitans, although local people knew that these ruined villages were right next to them, and one of them was Tela, and in Tela lived one of the early leaders of the Caste War. In fact, he had a hacienda in this village, indicating that he was like a cacique, or a local leader, and this site is like a very elaborate, large hacienda, and I don't know how you're dating it right now, but it's early, right? It's built in the 40s, maybe 30s, maybe before that?
Before that.
Maybe before that. And part of why we know this, as you taught me, is that it combines Spanish architectural forms like arches, Moorish arches, with and square buildings with traditional Mayan kind of circular oval buildings, right? Which you don't really see in haciendas from later in the 19th century. So right there, when I saw, the Spanish arches, which are themselves Moorish, right? Alongside these Maya oval buildings, all in a hacienda by a wealthy Maya leader who then becomes a rebel leader waging war against the Creole state. I saw and realized that I had to think about, let's call it racial capitalism here, in a kind of really temporally and geographically long wave. Because those Moorish arches reach back into the early modern period in Iberia, where ideas of race, raza, limpieza de sangre, are forged in the relationships between Christians and Jews and Muslims. And then, as Maria Elena Martinez has taught us in her incredible book, Genealogical Fictions, these ideas of limpieza de sangre were cooked up in Iberia in relationships among Jews and Muslims and Christians, brought to the Americas and to South Asia simultaneously by Spanish and Portuguese, deposited there, reworked locally in active relationship with folks like the Maya or in South Asia, to forge ideas of caste and casta that then get brought back to Europe and reworked there. So here, those arches alongside those oval buildings reminded me that race functions in this transnational way with longer histories than we usually granted. We can no longer say that race was invented in the 19th century, with the rise of racial science. It has hundreds and hundreds of years prehistory to that. And so it reminded me that these sites are places from which we can, are full of these signs that will allow us to decode this kind of geographically and historically long history of race. And that kind of burst onto the scene in a moment like the Caste War, but are developing ongoing. So that's one of the many things that I learned about being. I also learned about how contemporary the Caste War is. I mean, every year there's a festival in Teosuco in honor of the Caste War. And nobody has ever told me a clear account of when this festival started, but decades, it seems. It's been going, and it's not like, in Mexico, typically you expect to see celebrations of the revolution, right? In Yucatan, in Teosuco anyway, you get a celebration of the 1847 Caste War, which is a celebration of the Mayan uprising and slaughter of a lot of Creoles or Blancos on the peninsula. And this celebration consists in some local academics giving talks, but also Maya rap groups singing in Maya, bicycle races, teatro popular in Maya, oratory, and just like a whole village coming out and celebrating in these very contemporary ways, alongside stalls of like churros and elote and CDs pirated from Hollywood and all these things. This is like the contemporary world of the Caste War, right? And so from early modern Iberia to today's Teosuco, this history is like teaching us, I think, about this like incredible transnational, ongoing life of race, right? Hi.
Other contemporary discursive presence and how is that used today?
I'm not really sure that much. This is where I'm a little more locked in the 19th century than I ought to be. I mean, Richard, do you hear Chilam as a name for a prophet or a priest used a lot in contemporary?
Brought up in sort of a general sense of acknowledging, in my mind, that there remain these sort of prophetic books that probably existed up until sometime early part of the 20th century, and therefore, and then were again bought by foreigners, gules, these sort of white people devils who came in and bought these books and sold them for great quantities of money. but I think that Chilam Balam is almost being, in a very strange way, taken over by scholars and New Agers to represent this sort of construct of indigenousness as they look back at it. And almost I think some of the local people have said they don't want to be participating in that conversation as much. It's a strange way.
Yeah, the New Ageness. The New Ageness is interesting too because sometimes we disdain New Ageness because it's like this kind of contemporary version of something that's authentically older, but the libros of Chilam Balam were always contemporary versions of something that was older. They're all constantly revised, rewritten, reworked in contemporary circumstances. It seems like in the pre-colonial period and through the early colonial period up into through the 19th century. So they're very living documents, right? And so they probably don't have the same force that they do now, and yet the form of like repurposing that the 19th century libros represent, that form, that formal like strategy of is very much present. So that's kind of how I would say those, at least the libros. I don't know about Chilam as a name for a contemporary kind of prophet, but the libros as markers of that prophecy represent a kind of logic of repurposing and reworking. That's very much kind of what happens on that bus when people make a joke about the Mirta, right? That's like that's a prophetic utterance in a way. It's what is prophecy as a speech act? It's something that doesn't just describe a future. It's an utterance that plays a role in bringing the future that it seems simply to describe into being, right? So it's a little more than a description, right? And to the extent that people are imagining futures that they don't yet have, but they might want, those to me are prophecies.
Any last questions?
Yeah. Hi.
So I thank you so much for your talk about this. Your method of reading the theory and philosophy in these two epistollaries reveals political orientation to the everyday that's both invested in and inseparable from these futures people imagine, the desires they put into words, and the alliances that they claim, while at the same time redefining.
Yeah.
And there's also this excess that doesn't make it into the text of the letters that you nonetheless engage with, an apposition of like aspiration, aim.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you imagine your methodology, your orientation, engaging with archives in the making? So even like text messages, emails. Is your method necessarily limited to a historical archive? And if so, like,
Wow, what a great question.
How do you do this as
I'm a terrible presentist in those terms. My archives are getting older and older, like I said. I'm working on the 1690s, but absolutely. I mean, part of why I'm interested in now in archives from the 1690s is precisely that. I think they still have much to teach us and are still talking to us by virtue of being in those archives. So I'm not interested in them as in an antiquarian sense of like reconstructing what they really meant at the moment or anything like that. I think my approach to archives is Benjaminian, okay? I'm interested in archives that stand out to us at a contemporary moment of danger and speak to us in a way embedded in that contemporary moment, in a way that they might speak differently or not speak at all at another conjuncture, right? So to that extent, I think that ought to kind of reduce the distance between the 1690s or the 1840s and contemporary archives, and raise the question about archives as a hermeneutic one, not as a simply historicist one. A hermeneutic one. A how question. A Foucauldian question, if you will. Not what are these archives, but how are we reading them, right? And in that sense, although we want to keep track of their historical context and their situation, we ought not trap them in that context or imprison them in that context. Does that make sense? Yeah. But I want to know how you're reading text messages. That might make me less sick of them. Right? I text so much, it's
We
really
get the racing quickly.
Well, I better break that. No texting week, I think I need.
Thank you all
Thanks
for
a lot,
coming.
everyone.
Let's